Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast, episode 46. My name is Matt Wood. Today we'll be hearing from Axel Borg, distinguished wine and food science bibliographer emeritus at the University Library at the University of California, Davis. Axel worked for the Food and Wine Library for 33 years, helping to build it into the greatest of its type before retiring in 2020, though he still volunteers his time and knowledge to the food and wine community. I hope you enjoy. Here we go. Well, I'd love to ask you about your early life. Born in Germany?
I was born in Germany. I'm the oldest of four boys. My father was a career Army officer, but a hospital administrator, so he was always associated with military hospitals. Over the course of growing up, we lived in Michigan, Germany, but then Michigan and Texas and California and Bolivia. We did a tour overseas in Bolivia, and then in Maryland, and then back to Germany. And then it was in Germany that I left to go off to college. And that was in 1972. And I went to Pomona College in Southern California on an ROTC scholarship. My father insisted that all four of us apply for ROTC scholarships to pay for college, which all four of us got. Two of us actually went in and served in the Army. The other two didn't, for one reason or another. I graduated in 1976, went into the Army. My undergraduate degree was in history with an emphasis in ancient and medieval. I went on active duty in June of 1976, was initially stationed with an infantry unit at Fort Ord, California, and then went for my basic armor training, and then went to Germany, where I served for 4 years, served as a cavalry officer on the East German border, and then as an armor officer. And then I returned for more training at Fort Knox, the home of armor then. And then my last duty station was Fort Irwin in Southern California, north of Barstow, where I was part of a newly formed national training center, which has now gained it's extremely important to the Army for its realistic training. We were pioneering it. I left the Army in 1983, and then I went to Berkeley. So I left the Army in 1983, went to Berkeley and got a library degree, finished that in 1984, started working in the Natural Resources Library at Berkeley, which was the agriculture library, and decided that was what I really wanted to do, was work in the area of agricultural literature. So I worked there for a couple years, and then I got a job at UC Santa Cruz. It was the first career track position, and it was, in retrospect, really good because it gave me a general science grounding. So where I had spent sort of a 2-year internship learning agricultural literature, now I was exposed to more general chemistry and physics and mathematics and those kinds of things, which was very useful. And then in 1988, started at Davis. And my first day was the 1st of May, 1988. And I was there until the 29th of June, 2020.
What made you initially pursue the library track after coming out of the Army?
That's a good question. And, I look back on it, I think it was a really good decision. And I would like to think that I made it as a really informed decision. But really, getting out of the Army, I'd had a lot of management training. And logically, I should have gone on and gotten an MBA. But I didn't. I really loved books, and it was simply because of a love of books that I decided to go into library science. And I had a very influential high school librarian who introduced me to the concept of librarianship, so I knew something about it. But I really knew it through his eyes, which was high school librarianship, and that's such a small part of it. So I went to library school with really no idea of what type of specialization I would do. I really had no idea of the different specializations until I got there. Quite frankly, I was terrified. I had been out of school for 7.5 years in preparation for going to graduate school, and because I had to do it with some advanced planning. So there was 6 or 7 months that I was still in the Army, but I knew I was going to be getting out. So one of the things I thought I would need to learn or relearn, practice, was touch typing.
Oh, okay.
And my mother had insisted that I take a touch typing course in high school, so I knew how to type, and I practiced typing all through my undergraduate time period, but I hadn't really used it in the Army. And as it turned out, being able to touch type is a major skill to have as a librarianship. And most of the people that were working as librarians when I started, because we were making the transition to online computers and things like that, did the hunt and peck method.
Okay.
And because I can touch type, it sounds so simple, but anyway, so I went into librarianship because of a love of books. And then I had a great mentor when I was at Berkeley who taught me about agricultural literature. Her name was Norma Kobazina. And then when I went to Santa Cruz, I had a great mentor there who kind of steered me towards the concept or specialization of bibliography, specializing in the literature of a subject area in depth. His name was Bob Fessenden. And then when I got to when I left Santa Cruz and got to Davis, almost immediately was introduced to Maynard Amerine. And I had met him when I was working at Berkeley. He sent me a card thanking me for helping him with some questions when he came down. He said, this is for a book that will come out shortly, and you will probably hear about my next project after that. And that next project, it turned out to be the one that I worked with him on, which was his final bibliography. So I had a 10-year mentorship, about 10 years with Maynard Amerine at Davis. And then when he passed away, I'd already become friends with Darrell Cordy, and Darrell became my mentor. Now, Darrell doesn't like hearing that. He gets embarrassed, but Darrell is both a friend and a teacher, as anybody who knows Darrell. So that's sort of my training and exposure in becoming a librarian.
What are some of the things that you, I guess, took away from each one of sort of your three, I think you described them as your three great mentors?
Sure. So with Bob, it was the idea that one could really do a deep dive into a segment of literature and not just know how to find the books in that area. In other words, how to use the catalogs and finding tools, but knowing the literature in a deep way, knowing about the books, knowing where they came from, what the publishing pattern of them were. Where you see things like Hugh Johnson creates the wine atlas. It's a new genre. It's been copied quite a bit, but he's the first one who does it. And at some point, he starts having Jancis Robinson as second author. He's first author and she's second author. But then over time in later editions, she becomes first author and he drops off. It's been handed off to her in this case, because this is something that will need to continue since it's documenting something that is constantly changing. And you see that with many, many things where one person starts off with creating a particular book. As it evolves and changes, they bring somebody else in. So that's the bibliography part of it, really understanding how the literature is created, who's creating it, what it's about, that kind of thing. And then when I started working with Maynard Amerine, he would come to Davis about once a month, maybe once every 5 weeks, and spend the day. He would arrive about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, and he would bring stuff in a paper bag, and we would go through it. And sometimes it was articles that he wanted photocopied, and then he would direct that it go to someone, a colleague or someone that he had worked with. And then there were things that he was giving as part of his collections, ongoing gifts to the library, and he would talk about those. And then he would depart to have lunch with a friend. That would give me a chance to kind of do what I needed to do from the morning assignments.
Okay.
He would come back. He might continue what we'd been doing in the morning to wrap whatever that up was. And then usually there would be a 30 to 45-minute lesson on something. So I was being tutored.
Yeah.
And I was getting a decade-long tutoring from, one of the greats, probably the greatest wine scientist ever produced in the United States to date.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So it's an amazing experience, absolutely amazing. And then with Daryl, it's continued. I didn't socially interact with Maynard Amerine. It was always one-on-one, but not in a social sense. Well, with Daryl, it's both one-on-one and in a social sense. And I would say that Amerine was a mentor and friend, but it's a different kind of friendship that you have with someone more like Daryl.
Mm-hmm.
So Daryl's been to my house many times. I've been to Daryl's house. I was never at Amerine's place except, once to pick up material, but it was never in a social way.
Okay.
So you can see there's kind of an evolution to it. If I'd been able to plan this out, it would have been a great plan to have laid out, but it just happened. And it happened because of opportunities that presented itself.
What do you remember from those first days walking into the library at Davis when you started? I imagine it'd have to be kind of overwhelming with, although there's many more works now, there must have been quite a few that first day that you started also. How do you go about kind of getting your bearings when you start?
Well, that's a good question because, and I when I mentored young librarians, I would tell them that it takes time to learn a particular collection. You can already be well trained as a librarian in the theory, and you can have a lot of experience with another collection, but each collection's unique. And I knew that was going to be the case, having learned a collection at Berkeley and having learned a collection at UC Santa Cruz. So, and I knew that the collection that I was going to be going into at Davis was much narrower, more focused, and much richer than anything that I had encountered so far. So, in great ignorance, I said, I'm going to give myself 2 to 3 years to learn the collection. Well, 8 or 9 years into it, I was still learning the collection.
It's always growing too, huh?
Well, it's growing, but there's things that you find in it. And I would say that I still find new things in it 30 years down the road on that. Now, one of the things that I had the luxury to do, when I started at Davis, there were roughly 15,000 students. My department had 6 librarians, which we lost over time. So we had more staff than we did as we went forward.
Okay.
So that afforded me more time to spend in the stacks and looking at the books. And I decided that I would, and the Davis Library at that point was terribly overcrowded, and we were in the process of breaking ground to build the new wing. So this was before that new wing was added, and there just wasn't space. So a lot of books were literally piled on the floor.
Okay, wow.
All through the library. So this was a major problem. In any case, I located the collection on the basis of the call numbers that were assigned to it. So viticulture, grape growing is in one area, and winemaking was in another area. And there were some other areas that were separated off. For example, diseases of grapes were in a separate area. So basically, I knew where the collection was, and I started at one end, and each day that I had time, I would go down and I would spend time with the books, and I systematically handled every one.
Wow.
And I looked at it.
Okay.
And in some cases, I wouldn't spend more than a minute or two with a book. And in other cases, I spent 7, 8, 10 minutes. And if it was particularly interesting, I would take it back to my desk and spend some time with it. But it was the handling of it, looking at the title page, looking at the verso of the title page to see where it was printed, seeing if there were any book plates in it, so for previous ownership. Sometimes there were names written on the flyleaf that would indicate previous ownership. I wanted to see if anybody had written anything in it. In some cases, previous owners had written marginal notes. Maynard Amerine was a great one for commenting on the text in the margin. And, I have an aversion to defacing books that way, but you have to make exception when it's somebody like Amerine who's commenting on it, and you come across a book where he'll write in ink on the margin, utter nonsense, or too bad he can't spell. So, good point, or it's that kind of thing. So you hear the voice of other people, and then taking advantage of every time that somebody came in and wanted to use the collection to help them find material. And then because I had been handling the collection and looking at it, when somebody would come in, I could remember having seen a particular book and saying, oh, you might want to consider looking at this, or you might want to consider looking at that. And also paying attention to the call number system that we had for it, because we had to modify the Library of Congress system. One of the things that we were doing when I started was the available subject headings that are determined by the Library of Congress were rather limited in terms of a wine collection, and that's fine for most collections because you just don't have the depth on it. But for something like that, we were making up subject headings and using them as local subject headings. In talking with a cataloger, about 7, 8 years later, we started to, saying, this use of local subject headings is not a good idea. We should submit these subject headings to the Library of Congress and see if we can get them approved. So we started that about 15 years after I had started at Davis. And to date, I think we've got something like 75 or 80 new subject headings, which means that we're creating a lens that other people can use in describing their collection. For example, if you had books on Tokai wine from Hungary, at best it would be wine and winemaking - Hungary, which is not particularly useful.
Right.
So we submitted a subject heading we realized that we had about 10 or 12 books specifically on Tokai. So we submitted that subject heading and got it approved. And as new books come in, they're cataloged with Tokai, and the books that we had that subject heading added. Now, if we created something where there'd be hundreds of books that needed it, then we wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. But it's a really important thing to do, using the magnitude of the collection at Davis to essentially help the rest of the wine literature world.
Okay. Any other examples besides the Tokai one that you can remember off the top of your head?
We had names of specific wines where we would accumulate a particular mass of them. I'm drawing a blank on others at this point. It was an interesting process to go to, because basically the cataloger would say, we now have X number of books in this area. I think we ought to have a new subject heading. This is what I was thinking. We talk about it. Now, a problem that we had, this is an interesting problem. We wanted to have a subject heading for ampelographies. Ampelographies are that specialized literature and grapevine identification. And in the pre-molecular world, pre-molecular biology world, grapes are identified on the basis of morphology. So the shape of the berry, the shape of the cluster, the shape of the leaf, the surface of the leaf on the top and the bottom, the cane, all of those characteristics. And so consequently, it's hard to describe a grape and get an accurate description. So they're gravitated towards having illustrations. And so these early ampelographies and even newer ampelographies have wonderful illustrations where it's the intersection of art and science. So you have the science of describing grapevines, and then you have the artist's interpretation. But the artist has to show both the top of the leaf and the underside of the leaf, has to show the berries, has to show all of the characteristics of it. One of the first ampelography produced in California is the Bosque ampelography, 1877, I believe. And only 20-some grapes are illustrated in it. One of them is the one I like the most is Zinfandel. And the artist shows the uneven ripening of the Zinfandel berries as part of the characteristics to identify Zinfandel. So we submitted ampelography as a term to the Library of Congress to use as a subject heading, and they rejected it. And they won't tell us why they reject something. They just rejected it. So we thought about it, and we couldn't figure out why they had rejected it. But then we decided we would resubmit it, but not as a subject heading. It would be a genre or form heading. So you can have something like wine and winemaking manuals and handbooks. So this now is wine, or this would be viticulture ampelographies, as opposed to, or not, viticulture is not the, it would be viticulture ampelography, because before it was viticulture, or you could use the word grapes varieties as a subject heading, which was not particularly useful. So that's an example of something where we kind of struggled with it, finally got it done. Now we have yet to actually go through and tag all of those records. But once that's done, someone should be able to just type in find subject ampelography. It will pull it up because of the form part of the subject heading. And it will be very important for us because I believe the collection of ampelographies at Davis is the most extensive in the world.
Is it really? Okay.
Yeah.
So you said the first U.S. one you thought was about 1877. How far back does the Davis collection go?
Well, actually, that's the first California.
That's the first California. Okay.
I'd have to consider some others to see if they're really ampelographies. There's a man by the name of William Prince, who was a nurseryman in Long Island, who put out books about grapes. And so there may be some description of grapes in there that might make it an ampelography. That would be something that's sort of a judgment call. Okay. But the California one is, well, first of all, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's a wonderful example of early fine printing in San Francisco. The most recent one sold in auction for close to $500,000.
Wow.
So not cheap.
No, not at all. How far back does the collection go, maybe from France or Italy, say?
So there's a poem on wine that predates by a couple of years a book that I consider to be the first book on grape growing from France.
Okay.
So you could say that this earlier poem is the earliest item in French on wine. But a book called De Vie sur le Vin was printed in 1549.
Okay.
So just under 100 years after the advent of printing. So printing's thought to start about 1450, the first 50 years up to 1500. are the Incanabla period, where it's the beginning of printing. And this book, De Vie sur le Vin, at the time that it was offered to us, there were only two other known copies. One was in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the other was in the British Library in London. Now, the Bibliothèque Nationale's copy was 1550. The British Library's copy was 1549, and our copy is 1549.
Okay.
So the one that shows up in most of the scholarship is the French copy in the Bibliothèque Nationale, because when you're looking for something in French, that's where you would start. You wouldn't think to start with Davis or start with the British Library. Now, since we purchased it, and it was something that was an early purchase that I made, a number of other copies have surfaced as major European libraries get put online, their catalogs get digitized. And so things that were in those collections but essentially undiscovered are now emerging, and people are finding them. One of the nice things about that particular book, the author was an attorney with the French court. His father had been the French ambassador to Naples. So he had apparently been in Naples. And he's writing about grape growing. And he, at one point, uses the word terroir in a rather modern usage.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He'll say, for example, the Neapolitans planted Greek grapes and the terroir was wrong. Wow. Now, we don't know whether it's a variety called Greek grapes or that they're just grapes from Greece.
Okay.
It's a little vague. But he's at least making a judgment as to whether the location for cultivation of that particular grape was appropriate or not, which puts it into the concept of terroir.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting example that way. Now, terroir as a word predates that. Terroir originally meant dirt and was a derogatory term in terms of wine. It's only when it now it has a much different meaning. But this is a more contemporary kind of meaning to it. Mm-hmm. The author also cites his sources by making reference in the margin. So he'll cite Roman authors, noted authors on agriculture, Quimella and Varro. But then he also cites mythological sources. So,
okay.
So Bacchus says this, or Venus says this, or so-and-so says this. So I like the citations on it. I think, especially working in an academic setting, I'm sure that faculty have encountered rather mythical citations in some of their students' papers. It's a beautiful little book. It's actually in Middle French.
Okay.
So it's in a form of French that's closer to English than it is to modern French. Beautiful little thing. It's got as a frontispiece on the title page a woodcut of Bacchus, little baby Bacchus, sitting on top of the barrel. So,
I wish I had thought of the question before, because the book name is escaping me, but it's been said to be the Spanish book that the mission fathers referenced in grape growing in California.
I know of what you're talking about.
I think around that time, maybe early 16.
I think it's from the early. It may be from the late 1600s, early 1700s, and it was in a book. It was in an article of 10 books on California viticulture, I believe, that was published by Tom Penny. And I remember when I saw that article, and it might have been in Wine Enthusiast. I'd have to go back and check. I went through and checked to see if we had all of those books, and we do.
Okay.
So we have that one. We have the earliest book on on grape growing that were published in the United States.
Okay.
We have the earliest winemaking books that were published in the United States.
Were those in Boston
in
or
England,
Virginia or
Virginia,
Virginia? Okay.
I believe. And we also have the earliest thing that I know of in German is a couple page proclamation by the city of Nuremberg, and the date of publication is 1500.
Hmm.
And it's a complaint about the local margrave raising the tax on wine.
Okay.
So some things never change.
Yeah, there's always a lot of writing about raising the tax on
Mm-hmm.
wine in when you look through some of these old writings. That's
Sure.
a common complaint. But I think that brings me maybe to a good question, or something really unique is that the library collects language agnostic.
Yes, when you look at how academic libraries in the United States are as opposed to European academic libraries, most European academic libraries collect with a national bias. So French libraries tend to have largely French collections, and German libraries and so on. But in the United States, major academic libraries, especially a library like Davis that is going to have a level 5 collection, and maybe I ought to say just a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, of course.
65, 70 years ago, a system was devised for essentially describing the content of a collection in general terms, a ranking system, and the collecting effort that went into it. And RLG, Research Libraries Group, use this. Many libraries don't use it now, but it's still a gauge worth thinking about. So 0 level is meaning you're not collecting anything in that area. Level 1 would be something that a good public library would have,
Okay.
not something like New York Public Library, because that's a research library, but a good general public library. Level 2 is what you would expect to find in, say, a community college. Level 3 would be something that you would find in a good 4-year institution. Okay. Level 4 is able to support all levels of research and teaching in any academic library. Level 5 is beyond that.
Okay.
Okay.
That sounds sounds very rare for wine, probably.
Well, it's very rare for anything, because essentially you're saying you'll collect anything. And it describes the content, the level of the collection, but it also is used to gauge your collecting effort. So you could have, let's say, a level 4 collection in something, but you want to boost it up to level 4. I mean, you might have a level 3 collection, but you want to boost it up to a level 4 collection. So you're collecting at level 4, your collection is a level 3. Davis was level 5 collecting. Our collection level was 5, and the collecting level effort was 5. For example, I bought a book. I got a notice that there was a book available, a flyer. Sometimes that's the way you find out about these books, especially if they're not published by a mainline publisher. Okay. And in this case, the title caught my attention, and it was 101 formula for freeze-drying wine.
Okay.
Freeze-drying alcohol.
Okay.
I didn't think you could freeze-dry alcohol.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Actually, it turns out you can. But at the time, I don't think anybody knew that you could do that. It's not something that's done commonly. But anything that says 101 Dalmatians, 101 formula attracts your attention. Yeah. The other thing that attracted my attention is in book flyers, especially from mainline publishers, it generally gives the spine height of the book. That tells you roughly where you're going to put it in your collection. This one gave both the spine height and the length of the book. So it was the height and length of the book, which was very unusual because, again, those were magic numbers, 8.5 by 11.
Okay.
This was a book, when it arrived, was put together in Xerox sheets.
Yeah. The little spiral bound.
Well, yeah, kind of. I don't remember. I think it was There's a kind of binding called a velabind, I
Okay.
think, that is what they used. I have to go back and take a look at it. In any case, we're the only institution in the world, I believe, that has a copy of this. And you could say, well, this sounds like bad science. This sounds like something questionable. Why would you add that to your collection? Well, it's because we're the record, we're essentially providing or preserving the record of wine,
Hmm.
including what would be questionable literature on that. It's up to the scholar to evaluate it or the scientist to evaluate it and pass judgment on it. So that made the effort in developing the collection was not so much should we buy this book or not. It was how do we get it? Can we afford it? And so seeking these things out, most of the effort was in seeking things out. And we collected in any language. So we were language agnostic. If a book was originally published, say, in English and translated into Japanese and Spanish, which is the case of Winkley's book on general viticulture, we would have both the English and the Spanish and the Japanese versions of it.
Okay.
And if the book was originally in, say, a foreign language, and then translated into other foreign languages and English, we would attempt to have all of the languages that the book had been published in. We don't have all editions, all translations, but we've got more than most anybody else has. I've identified 52 different languages in the collection,
Okay.
which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
The most recent one was it's first thing that we have, first and only thing that we have that I know of in Tibetan.
Okay.
It's a poem on wine.
Okay. Recent or older?
It's a very old poem.
Okay.
It was recently translated into English.
Okay.
And the author, who's in a Tibetan monastery, Tibetan monk in a Tibetan monastery in Marin, I believe, gave us a copy of it.
Oh, okay. Very nice. Local connection. Any favorite piece in the library? It's like picking your children, probably, but
yeah, I kind of think of them as my children as I purchase them. One book, and usually it's the stories associated with them.
Okay.
So this is a story associated with Daryl Cordy. And Daryl called me one day and asked me if we had a particular book. And he gave me the title, and he gave me the author and the date, 1608. And
Okay.
it was a book on distillation. I checked and I said, no, we don't have it. I was in the middle of something, so I didn't follow up at that point, but I didn't throw away my notes on it. And it wasn't until the next day when I looked at the notes again that I thought, well, because he said, oh, well, then I'm going to get it for you.
Okay.
So I thought I better do some work on this. So I did, and I found out that there was a copy of the book available through Jonathan Hill, who was an antiquarian dealer in New York. And sure enough, Daryl bought the book for us. It was very expensive. Daryl got the book, read it himself, and then he donated it to the library in honor of Jim Guyman, who was the distillation professor before Roger Bolton, who was the previous distillation professor. I believe it's Ron Runnebaum is the one who covers distillation now. Beautiful book on distillation, not just of alcohol, but of essential oils and other kinds of things.
Okay.
Really gorgeous illustrations in it. And a couple years later, I was showing the book to two students who had just finished the program, had just graduated, and were getting ready to leave. And they had I'd talked to them about the wine library, and at some point they said, well, can you show us some of the things? So they came over, and I was showing them this book. It was in special collections. And I had stepped away from them. I was still, they could see them, but I wasn't right next to them. And I heard one of them whisper to the other, did you bring your phone? Let's take some pictures. These would make great tattoos.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So about a decade later, I get a photograph from a faculty member who had run into one of the students, and when he saw her, she said, "Oh, is Axel still working in the library?" And he said, "Oh, yes, she is." So she lifted up her arm and said, "Take a picture of this and send it to him." And that was the tattoo from that particular book.
Wow.
And it turns out she has a fraternal twin sister, and she'd gotten the same tattoo, but in a slightly different part on her arm.
Okay.
So this is a really wonderful example of how exposure to such literature can leave, pardon the pun, an indelible mark on the student.
Have there been some that got away?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The first printed book on wine is a translation of I think it's a 12th century text by a Catalan physician by the name of Arnoldus de Villanova. He wrote extensively about medicine in general, and he wrote one work about wine as medicine. And actually, wine is the first medicine. It's used. Properties of alcohol can be a sedative. Alcohol is used to dissolve medicines into liquid form for consumption. So wine is a very, very early, if not the earliest medicine. In any case, this book, this treatise on wine as medicine, was translated into German and printed in Germany, I think, not too long after the advent of printing, 1470 something. In any case, there are very, very few copies of the first printings, and they're all held in institutions, I believe.
Okay.
So a later set of Arnoldus de Villanova's writings appeared on the market, and it included that treatise on wine. So it was printed after 1500, but it was still a very early copy. Now we have it in facsimile, but we didn't have it original. So I contacted the dealer, and he was willing to give us a little bit of a price break, but it was still very expensive. And so I attempted to see if I could raise some money, and was not able to raise the money. It was going to be, if I recall correctly, it was probably going to be in the order of $20,000. Now that's cheap, okay, compared to things today. That same thing would probably go for $100,000 today. So that's an example of something that got away simply because we didn't have the money. Mm-hmm. And there's been other things that I've salivated over, mm-hmm, and that I've coveted, but I knew that we just didn't have the resources. You have to remember we're a public institution, and so the majority of the money that comes to support the library is strictly to support instruction. So okay, we buy current books to support undergraduate instruction. The things beyond that, especially at the level that we're collecting in the area of wine, we're really dependent upon gifts of books. Daryl's been particularly generous, and then donations of money to fund things. There's a small endowment named for Maynard Amerine that generates a couple $1,000 a year, allows us to buy one or two moderately rare books. But we have so many already that but that doesn't mean that we're not constantly seeing other new things, rare things that are out there. My dream would be, and I know that the current library administration is going to try and move in that direction to the degree that they can. We have a new director at the library, and he's very supportive of raising money for the collection. But there needs to be an endowment of probably something on the order of $25 to $45 million to adequately support the purchase of rare material, to continue to purchase new material that's coming out, to have the staff that can help people use the collection. So that's really the long-term goal, is to raise money. Now, I think when the new director hears the figure that I mentioned, he's going to swallow hard, because I think he's thinking in the area of 20 million. But that's certainly a start, and certainly I think that with a lot of work, development work, there are people out there that would be interested in endowing various parts of it. And we've already got a start in that, in the gift that Warren Winiarski made to support the Wine Writer collection.
Yeah, and you guys have the papers of some really amazing writers, both California-based and England. And
right. When I started, one of the first papers that I was involved in getting for the library was the papers of Leon Adams. And Leon Adams is considered the dean of California wine writers. And he wrote a book called The Wines of America, which is credited with the first post-war education of the American public on wine.
I have it sitting right below me here.
It's still a very, very important book.
Yeah.
I think it went into 4 editions, and certainly his papers were a really great start in that. And then sometime later, we got the papers of Roy Brady, who was a wine writer in Southern California. About 10 years ago, I got an email from Hugh Johnson. He had asked his editor at University of California Press if he knew of anybody that might be interested in his papers, because they were going to be downsizing and he needed to find a place for it. So he suggested Davis. He contacted us, and that started the ball rolling. And we didn't have the money to process the papers, and it's expensive to do that, because you need to describe the contents, you need to rehouse it in archival material. So it's acid-free material, because most papers acidic. So you need to take care of it to preserve it for future use, as well as make it accessible, which means describing each of the individual items in it. Warren Winiarski gave us a gift to process those papers. And I think there was some that was left over that we used then for other processing. When we first met with Hugh, towards the end of that meeting, I said, in the 25 years that I'd been at Davis, Jancis Robinson had not come to Davis. And he said, "Oh, we'll fix that." And he then introduced Jancis to the library director, who was in England on a business trip. And so her papers came in. And then through Hugh Johnson, we got, through his contacts, we got Michael Broadbent's notebooks. Wow. And then at that point, well, it was before the Michael Broadbent gift, we had essentially 4 key papers. We had Leon Adams' papers, we had Roy Brady's. Those were 2 representing California writers. And then we had the premier wine writer in the world, Hugh Johnson, and then Jancis Robinson, who's probably the best known at this point, certainly among the younger generation. And the library administration asked me to write up a proposal capitalizing on a wine writer collection. So I wrote that up, took it to our development officer, who said, okay, if we're going to do this, this is the kind of endowment that we need to have. And it pegged out at about $3.5 million. And then she went to Warren Winiarski, and Warren donated $3.3 million to create the wine writer collection at UC Davis, which then started the ball rolling of getting other papers in. Now, some of these, there's a subset within the wine writer collection that's the Warren Winiarski wine writer collection, as I understand it. And it's those authors, those writers that he felt contributed to the emergence of California as a wine powerhouse. And he saw wine writing as a way to inform the winemaker about their progress. So it was a feedback loop in a sense. It was a way for the winemaker to get feedback on what they were doing. I remember listening to a recording of Maynard Amerine in his wine sensory class, and he was talking to the students. This would have been about 1972, 1973, sometime in there. And he was talking about how earlier in California, the winemaker would make wine and his family and his neighbors would be drinking it. And he would get feedback on that wine from his family and his neighbors. But then as the wine industry evolved and got bigger and more sophisticated, and wine was going further afield, the winemaker wasn't getting very much input or feedback on how they were doing on that. And I think that this was the thing that Warren saw that was so important to the emergence of California wine, especially post Judgment of Paris, which of course he had such a stellar role in.
Of course, yeah.
So, but the papers include Karen McNeil's papers. Trying to think of other people that I can't think of specific names. I know that the current wine archivist, Audrey Russick at Davis, has been bringing in a significant number of collections to UC Davis that encapsulate this idea that Warren had of the impact of wine writing. He, I believe he said, good writing makes better wine, or something along those lines. But it's the idea that the writer influences the winemaker. Good writing influences the winemaker. And then just recently, there's been a Warren funded a couple-year program to have a wine writer in residence, and this was in honor of Stephen Spurrier. And so the first wine writer in residence will be at Davis this fall. That'll be Meg Barnhart. So I'm looking forward to that, and that this hopefully will start a longer term of having wine writers in residence, which then will be an opportunity for them to interact with the collection, for them to interact with the faculty, and for students at Davis to have direct interaction with people that are writing about wine, to hopefully train and prepare the next generation of wine writers.
I think one of the writers' papers that you have are Charles Sullivan.
Yes.
I think he's probably my favorite of sort of that generation of California historical writers. But to take it back to something you said earlier, I would love somebody to do a new version of his companion to California wine, because I love that as a reference book. So much info in little bite-sized pieces. You could look up anybody in California wine from the last 200 years and get a little bite-sized info.
That book, A Companion to California Wine, was one of 8 or 9 books that I had at my desk, so that when there would be reference questions that would come in, I could have that immediately without having to go to the stacks. I had a copy of Jancis Robinson's pocket ampelography. There was a dictionary. I'm trying to remember some of the other things, but Charles Sullivan's Companion to California Wine is very, very important. He was a fascinating person, and I got to know him, and we interviewed him shortly before he died about how he got into wine, wine writing. He was a wine historian. There's lots of different types of writers. There's the wine historian, like Charles Sullivan and Tom Penny, and they had a great correspondence with each other, all in writing, no email. It was all handwritten letters. And I'd taken expository writing from Tom Penny as a freshman. So
really? Okay.
For a long time. But you have wine historians, then you have people that write about wine, contemporary wine, but in an encyclopedic way, like Karen McNeil. You have people that write about the wine experience. You have people that are writing essentially to promote and sell wine. There was a wonderful talk that was given by a colleague of mine, Julianne Ballou, at the California International Antiquarian Book Show in Oakland 3 years ago now, I believe. And I believe it's taped and at the website. But she talks about, because she was the first Warren Winiarski wine writer fellow.
Okay.
She was the one that created the program, got it going, started bringing in collections, started grappling with who is a writer, what kind of writer are they, where do they fit in this, because there are so many different types of writers and what they do. And I listened to her talk when she gave it, and I've gone back and listened to it on tape a couple times now, because each time I refine my insight into the wine writer phenomena. What is it? It's there's more variety in wine writers than there are in wine makers.
And there's also sort of the newspaper style, I think, where you're kind of writing for maybe more of a casual audience, maybe people that aren't, really digging into wine every day, and you're maybe trying to bring people along with it, like writing for the Times or the Chronicle, or we talked about Mike Dunn papers there also.
We have Bob Thompson's papers, and we were having lunch with him at the point that he'd brought his papers over, and someone asked him, "Well, what did you do before you were a wine writer?" And he said, "Well, I was a sports writer."
Huh. Okay.
And then he started ticking off other names of people that had been sports writers and gone into wine or food writing. And I was thinking, well, that's a really interesting progression. Why, how does that happen? Is there a connection in that? And it occurred to me that both the sports writer and the wine writer are recounting an experience for somebody that wasn't there. And doing it in a way that is engaging and informing.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Now, I don't know if there's any validity to that. You have to take what I say with a grain of salt.
Yeah, that's an interesting crossover, though. You don't think of the sports writer to food and wine writer crossover happening. What were some of the changes you saw at the library over your time there? I mean, obviously, I guess print to digital it's probably an easy one, but I imagine there's some others.
Well, in the print to digital change did not happen in a uniform way in the library. It really was driven by money. And in that sense, the money in publishing is in the sciences, and within the sciences, you would say that the money in publishing is in medicine. And so the first fields that really made the leap to digital were the areas of medicine. And there's some wine material in medicine, even contemporary medicine, where you're talking about the effects of wine and alcohol consumption and the debate on whether moderate consumption is good or not. And that's a debate that continues. So when I started at Davis, they had plans to build the new wing. And at that point, they were just breaking ground when I first arrived, and that process took 2.5 years to build that new wing. Library construction is about the most expensive construction you can do because you have to reinforce the floors for the weight of the books. Mm-hmm. And the state had wanted to get out of the business of supporting new library buildings. And so there was a move to put a lot of material, printed material, in storage and remote storage. And there's a big book storage site in Richmond, California, that serves the Northern California campuses. And then there's another similar facility on the UCLA campus in Southern California that serves the Southern UC campuses. But the library, the state said, we'll build a building for you. And I think that we were one of the last ones that got a building funded by the state, or at least partially funded by the state. Okay. And they said it can have 10 years of growth in it. And the 10-year growth period starts at the time you break ground. So essentially, you're losing 2 years or 2.5 years of growth room. Mm-hmm. Well, what we found in that decade after, the first decade that I was at Davis, was the transition of the beginning of the transition into digital. And the area that it impacted the most initially was journals. And we had thousands of feet of journals in paper-bound journals in the library. And many of those journals switched over to a digital form. And we had an overlap for a long period of time. But at some point, we realized that the users were only using the digital version. They weren't using the print version. And so we were able to say a very important journal like Science or Nature, that we would have 2 bound copies of, one that would circulate and one that was library use only. That went digital, and we didn't need 2 bound copies. And in fact, we probably didn't need any bound copies, so long as there was 1 paper copy somewhere that was in safe storage, that in the event that we lost the digital copy from some catastrophe, that we could redigitize it from the original paper. So it meant that the rest of the library really didn't fill up. There was lots of space left. And so 20 years after the new library was started, the new wing was started, we still had growth room in most areas of the library, except for the wine collection, which was one of the wine and food collection. Now, the food science part was part of science, and it saw a move to digital before the wine journals did. And the very last to transition, and some of them started to transition, and then interestingly enough was essentially rejected by the readership, was some of the popular journals that they would want to go digital, but then the person who was subscribing to the newsletter said, no, I don't want that. I want the paper copy. And so they went back to it. So space was always a problem in the wine collection. And it was always just an estimate as to the number of volumes in the collection. But my estimate was that when I started there was something like something under 20,000 volumes constituted the grape growing and winemaking part of the collection. Okay. And by the time I left, I would say that it was probably on the order of about 35,000. Significant increase.
So, yeah, nearly
doubled. And that takes up a lot of space on the shelf. And so space was always a problem in that. The other parts, the food science part, the technical part, and it it saw it began to see a transition into the electronic part of it, or the digital part of it, um, after medicine, after the mainline sciences. But it's still was significant in terms of its reduction. Now, one of the things that evolved for me was my understanding of what was the collection that I was serving, because grape growing and winemaking, the viticulture and enology department, was one of the departments that I was charged with supporting, but I was also charged with supporting the food science department, and I was charged with supporting the nutrition department on campus, human nutrition.
Okay.
So it really meant that I was dealing with food writ large, food in the very broadest sense, and wine is a food, and that also corresponds to a movement that started about the time that I started in librarianship, which was to recast the popular perception of wine away from being a alcoholic beverage that was a sin to being a natural part of one's diet. And that was something that Robert Mondavi was trying to do with his mission, which was to popularize wine and normalize wine. It corresponded with a lot of stuff that was coming out of the nutrition department at UC Davis, and it was coming out of the work that was being done by the Wine Institute, sort of three different groups, not necessarily working in concert, but essentially working in the direction of saying wine in moderation is a natural part, or should be a natural part of our diet. Well, we're not dealing with just wine. We're dealing with wine and beer and spirits, and we're dealing with food in general. And the collection at Davis is preeminent in the area of the scientific and technical work on wine and food, or food and wine. Is probably the better way to describe it, although Robert Mondavi would turn in his grave if I put wine after food instead of wine in front of food. And then we have a preeminent collection of the popular literature. So we have the scientific and technical on one end of the spectrum, the popular on the other end of the spectrum, and in between that, we have the trade literature, the literature that is written for the practitioner in the field. And in some cases, the real wine enthusiast, the person who wants to immerse themselves in wine but maybe not make wine, will read some of the trade literature. They might even read some of the scientific literature. And so to have all three of those areas at the level that we have is the reason that the collection is the finest in the world. That, coupled with this language agnostic and trying to collect everything, all possible editions on it. So every possible variety of the book. And I'll give an example that I think illustrates that. Back in the 80s, Hugh Johnson did a PBS series on the history of wine, and there was a book that accompanied it. And I bought that book because it came out after I had started at Davis. I bought a copy for the library and found that it was very useful, so I actually bought several copies. And then I noticed a copy that looked like it might be that book, but it had a different title. And so I bought, but it would have been similar. So I bought that for the collection. And when I examined the two copies, this gets into the bibliographer part of it, I noticed that the text block was identical. It had been printed, I believe, in Singapore.
Okay.
There was a difference in title page. That had two different titles, but essentially it was the same book. Publishers would do that every once in a while in the hopes of selling more copies on that. But that I would want to have that for the collection. I think it's important to have that for the collection. So there's someone later on said, "Oh, I see there were these two books. What's the difference? What's the relationship between them?" And you can see the only difference is the title.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the text is identical.
Yeah. After you get past the third page, the rest are
exactly.
The rest are identical.
Exactly.
Is there a part of the collection that you think is especially strong, or a part that for as good as it may be, you think it lags a little bit behind other aspects of the collection?
Yeah, there are parts that lag behind. One of the areas is international law. Although we're very strong in it, I know there's more things that we could get.
Okay.
We have a preeminent, probably the best collection in the world on. I know it's best collection. It's better than what's in the British Library of the laws that regulated the making of port wine. These started in 1750 and went up to 1850. And so, that's an example of wine law. But I also know that there's a lot of regulations that appeared during, started in the 1500s with regard to wine trade, wine manufacture, that kind of thing, that were published in France, because I see them show up every once in a while. Be nice to be scooping up those and getting those. It would be nice to go through and see what we could find on regulation of wine in, or for that matter, any alcoholic beverages in other European countries, especially as you go further east. I would say that we could do a lot of collecting in Central and Eastern European collections. I had a colleague that was a gifted linguist and could locate items on occasion. So we would buy things in Polish and Ukrainian, Lithuanian, on various various topics relating to food and drink. So those are areas that there could certainly be more expansion in. We're not very strong at all in Asian language material. I think that would be something that would be really useful to add to. There was an area that I kind of realized, hey, we're missing out on this. This was about a decade ago. But I just didn't have the resources to be able to pursue it in a systematic way. And that's the literature of the sommelier.
Okay.
People writing about food and wine matching, pairing.
Yeah.
The thing that brought it to my attention was we were able to order them. There were books printed, I believe, in China, in Chinese, about food and wine pairing, especially European wines, and certainly as China's wines are emerging, that would be another area to look at, is the literature that is in China. I had hopes, again, that were not realized. We had a partnership with Jiangnan University in China, which was their premier food science university, research institution. And when you go to buy books in Chinese about China, they tend to be on language and culture. I think that it would be natural that most publishers would say, who's going to buy a book in Chinese on how to make wine when there's perfectly good books on how to make wine in English? But it would be useful to have those, especially as different Chinese winemaking traditions are becoming more and more, there's becoming more and more awareness of different Chinese winemaking traditions in the West. So that's also another area. And if we're going to really do food in its very broadest sense, then, and this kind of goes back to my days at Berkeley, Berkeley had a really good collection of food composition tables. And there was something that I'd been trying to collect at Davis as I was able to do that. And we had a pretty good collection of them, but there were some UN and FAO, Food Organization of the United Nations, FAO, both UN separately, but then FAO is a UN agency. They were a major publisher in the United Nations. They would publish some fairly exotic nutrition or food composition tables. I remember seeing one, and it's sort of one that I've been looking for. When I think of it, I'll go and poke around and see if I can find it. But it had the nutritional composition of a variety of bugs and grubs and worms and other things that were part of indigenous cuisine in Southeast Asia. So I think that would be a great thing to have. We do have a food composition table from China, and you can find the nutritional composition of such exotic meats as camel and snake. And I hesitate to mention this because I have a dog, but dog meat was one of the things. So, if you're a student of nutrition and you're trying to find that kind of information, here it is.
Yeah, it's out there if you can use it.
The area of food as a subject in its very broadest context spans from the scientific and technical all the way into cultural and religious. And it's very, very, it's so broad, and it really touches on the human experience. And in that sense, and it's also something that is universal. So I would say that there's going to be something in every language, every written language, that has something about food in it, and in any one of those, or maybe all of those contexts on that. So it really is. There's absolutely no way it will be an absolutely comprehensive collection, because that's an impossibility.
Yeah, it evolves a lot. Also, it's always changing.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It is changing. It's evolving. All of those kinds of things, but it also, the collection at Davis has more than anybody else has. But there's also much for people to learn. And I had a new colleague at one point near the end of my career say to me, "Do you feel you've arrived? Do you know it all?" And I was taken aback by the question, and I said, "Absolutely not. If anything, I realized that there's so much more that I don't know than I did when I started. I go back and look at things that I wrote about the collection 10 years into it and realize just what an ignorant fool I was." I'm sure if I looked back in 10 years now on this, I would be even more embarrassed by my ignorance on it. But that's the wonderful thing about it. It was, and still is, a journey. And if you think that you've arrived, you've missed the point.
Yeah, there's always so much more to learn. And if you just follow the trails kind of where it takes you, and you can get pretty deep into something pretty quickly if you just kind of follow each little path. It gets
it's easy to go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a lot of fun to go down the rabbit hole. I think the joy for me was, as I was going down the rabbit hole, realizing that I was, and enjoying the process, and then hoping that I could remember some of that experience later on, and maybe make use of it.
You've had a couple published works also, right? You did the one with Maynard Amerine early on, but you also did a bibliography of the California agriculture experiment stations.
That's an interesting one, because that technically was never published.
Oh, okay. That's why I can't find it.
That's why you can't find it. I did that as a project when I first started at Berkeley, was to get a grasp of what had been published by the California Agriculture Experiment Station. And we had most of it there at Berkeley. There were some things that we didn't have, which resulted in going up to Davis at one point. But that was a project that when I got to Santa Cruz, I asked for some money to generate 10 draft copies. And then I intended to have it published. So the reason that I was having the draft copies made was I was going to distribute them to, because I was at Santa Cruz at this point, one to Berkeley, one to Davis, one to Riverside, and then to some other people to get comments on and see about corrections and those kinds of things. So I had it in digital form, and at one point, a public library, the librarian there asked me for a copy of my manuscript, which I printed and gave to him. He then had it cataloged for their collection. And then because he had cataloged it in their library, it got picked up by the Library of Congress as a record out there floating around, which then I think Amazon scooped up.
Okay.
And you can go into Amazon, but then it says availability unknown or something like that.
Okay.
So I did a bibliography on California agricultural literature. I did a bibliography on the collection of the Inglenook Library that had been built by Gustav Niebaum.
Okay.
And then a collection of the California State California State Viticultural Commission.
Yeah.
Because they had an important library. Now I'm working on a manuscript because I cleaned those two versions that got out there and got picked up and cataloged. They're incomplete because I was still working on them, tracking down items. And recently, about a year or so ago, I cleaned up both of those catalogs, and I'm in the process of writing a history of those two collections because they make a really nice contrast. One was a privately built collection in a winery, the Inglenook collection, and one was a publicly built collection by the State Board of Viticulture Commissioners, which was supposed to be available to the public. Both ended up at Davis eventually, but they're contemporary. They're in the 1880s and 1890s that they were built, so they're contemporary collections. They make for a really nice contrast. The Inglenook one has more cultural and historical material in it than the Board's library. The Board's library had probably the best collection of early pamphlets on phylloxera.
Yeah, that's like the Bioletti writings and Hilgard and those.
In Hilgard, but in fact, the first publication that Hilgard made at the University of California was on the vine louse, which is phylloxera. In 1880, there was a phylloxera crisis in California, and it prompted the California legislature, at the urging of Charles Wetmore, to appropriate $10,000 to this problem and to create the State Board of Viticulture Commissioners. It charged the University of California with doing research in that area, and it charged the commissioners with education and information gathering. The commissioners, there was no instructions on how to divide the money between these two boards. The head of the board was Charles Wetmore. The head of the university was Eugene Hilgard. They were in many ways diametrically opposite people. Hilgard believed in science and felt that if you knew the scientific background to winemaking, you were less likely to screw it up, which is true. And Wetmore believed that anybody was capable of making a brilliant bottle of wine, which is also true, but they're different ends in the spectrum. This led to a 14-year fight, and eventually the legislature closed down the board and directed that the library and resources be transferred to the University of California. So that's a project that I have. I have the two bibliographies for those two libraries, so you can see what's in it. And then I've written about half of the manuscript.
Okay.
There's an introduction to what was going on in California at that time to set the set, to outline the setting, and then how the board library came about, how the Inglenook Library came about, and then about the board library, sort of its composition, its strengths and weaknesses, and then about the Inglenook collection. And I don't have a publisher, and I don't have a target date. It's something that I go back and poke at as I can.
Well, you have me interested. I love the Board of Viticulture and the experiment station papers. So you've got one buyer at least.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, it's incredibly rich material. Of the first, I think, 80 plus bulletins that were written by the Agriculture Experiment Station, Hilgard writes over half of them.
Mm-hmm.
He's a polymath in many ways. He's writing about soil composition. He's writing about water composition. He predicts the selenium problem in the Central Valley.
Right.
Of course, he's writing about different grape varieties. He's writing about fermentation. He makes the first observations that at some point red wine doesn't get any darker staying on the skins. That chemistry is not understood until 100 years later when Roger Bolton works out that it's the polyphenols that provide something for the anthocyanins provide something for the tannins to bind to. So Hilgard's an amazing person. He sets the tone for the University of California in many ways. Mm-hmm. And those publications are they're still useful. And they've all been digitized.
Yeah, on the Internet Archive.
Right. We did that through Internet Archive, and there's individual catalog records for each of the titles in the Davis catalog that then provides a link to Internet Archive. But you can also just go into Internet Archive and pull up that collection of material, and you can sort of browse your way through if you wanted to.
Yeah, it's a great collection. Some super interesting things in there and stuff that gets written about way earlier than you maybe expect that it was.
Absolutely.
I wasn't sure if there was anything else you'd like to speak about, something we missed or something close to your heart with the library. Anything at all is fine. Stories, whatever you like.
Oh, there's all sorts of things, but I think I've covered sort of a coherent whole to it. I've talked a little bit about how I would develop the collection. I talked a little bit about the collection. I mean, you could go on and on about things. It would be really nice to have the items and show the items and have people, look at them. That was really one of the things I enjoyed the most, was when I could take people into the collection and literally pull things off the shelf to show people. Mm-hmm. People were surprised that we have a comprehensive collection of winery dog books.
Oh, really?
Yes. Well, they're an important part of the winery culture. And, the winery dogs of New Zealand or the winery dogs of Australia. So there's a lot of whimsical stuff in the collection. There's a lot of certainly, and we've been talking mainly about the wine part of it or the grape part of it, but there's some really marvelous food items, especially in special collections.
Any favorites from the food collection?
Well, one that I'll mention is it's an invitation to a dinner. I believe it's in 1908. Visually, it looks like a long, narrow poster that would have been done in the psychedelic 60s.
Okay.
But it's called Zero Family Dinner. And it is, as far as we can tell, it was published by a major printer in San Francisco who was probably one of the guests at this dinner. It appears to be potluck, or each of the dishes is associated with one of the guests, maybe created for the guest. It's rather cryptic. So it's something that would begs for someone who would be interested in California or San Francisco society of 1908 as figuring out who these people are. I think you probably could if you delved into society, San Francisco society, which is, it's an interesting period. It's right post-earthquake. It's sort of San Francisco as it's emerging right before World War I. And it's not the Barbary Coast days. It's not the Bohemian Club days, although the Bohemian Club would have been very prominent in this. But it's this sort of psychedelic coloring and these jokes that are made about people through the dishes that are mentioned in the dinner or in this invitation to this dinner, which also is, in a way, a recitation of what the dinner is going to be. So it's a menu. And it's, if I remember correctly, it's about 4.5 feet long and about maybe 5 feet long and about 10 inches wide.
Okay.
But at first glance, people think it's something from the 60s.
Huh. Is it given by a restaurant of the day or anything?
It doesn't appear to be given by a restaurant of the day. It appears to be in a private home. Okay. And the zero family, we think, is people who have no relatives or no families to go to. Maybe it's held, I think there is a date for it. So maybe it's held, a dinner that's being held in commemoration or in honor or to celebrate. But these are people that would not normally have family to go to, so they're congregating together. That's why the zero family. Mm-hmm. Although the reading would be the family name Zero.
Right.
So it's a cryptic piece. It's a mysterious piece. It's unique. I don't know of any other library that has it. There were probably 8 copies made. So it's something that's a very unique printed item, and beautiful and mysterious and culturally significant to San Francisco's history.
Wow. That sounds really interesting.
The special collections had it made into a bookmark, a miniature version of it, which it kind of lent itself to. It's really nice.
Thanks for listening to our conversation today. The UC Davis Library, either online or in person, is an amazing resource. If nothing else, you should check out the wine label collection online. It's probably a good time to give Warren Winiarski a heartfelt thanks for his contributions to the library, allowing them to acquire some of the collections we discussed. I need to give credit also to Daniel Callan of Slime Dance Cooperative Wines and episode 21 guest for the suggestion of Axel and a primer on his work. Since then, I feel like I see his name everywhere, book credits, wine events. He's been involved in a lot over the years. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. And feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you could tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you choose to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs like gas money and travel and research book purchases. Any amount is appreciated. I have a small token of my appreciation to send to you also if you do. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.